This section focuses on the practice or the discipline of theology. The first thing we're going to look at is the difference between the academic fields of religious studies, which is practiced in state-funded universities, and the academic field of theology, which is practiced in non-state-funded universities. So when we look at religious studies, religious studies does not assert that the transcendent world exists, right? They aren't starting from the starting point of a belief in God or some other ultimate reality. It simply analyzes religions and the practice of religions. So if you look to the right there, you'll see different fields within religious studies or different disciplines within it. Anthropology of religion, right? Comparative religion, history of religion. So they're always kind of looking at religion without taking a stance on whether the transcendent world exists or not. Now, one of the reasons that you have this field in state-funded institutions is because of the First Amendment here in the United States, right? The First Amendment says that government cannot endorse any religion. This is not because government is against religions. It was actually established so that people would have freedom to practice their religion, right? In the founding days of our country, it was seen that if one religion is endorsed by the state, then other religions really will not be able to practice freely there. And so this First Amendment right, the right of freedom of religion, right? It's not against religion. It's actually aimed to help people have the space to practice their faith. Okay, moving on then to theology. And theology is a science in the general term, an academic field that begins by accepting the transcendent world exists. They begin by accepting that God or some other ultimate reality is real, and then attempt to understand it. Again, this attempt to understand it is through the use of reason, just like any other academic field. That's why theology can be called a science in the general use of the term, right? So if you want to understand the way that we're doing theology here at this Catholic university, you can use St. Anselm's quote, faith seeking understanding, right? Yes, we're going to start with faith. Yes, we're going to assume that the ultimate reality exists. And then we're going to seek to understand it using reason. So as we kind of already hit on here, theology is concerned with the questions of the ultimate meaning of life, the ultimate nature of reality in human life, the transcendent as we have been talking about it. But it also insists on the use of reason, right? I mean, it is an academic discipline, right? It is something that we're going to study. So we're using reason. We're not just, putting out ideas and then saying, hey, believe this because we said so. No, theology involves the very use of reason to inspect and understand the faith. Okay, so we're practicing theology in the contemporary postmodern world. The use of reason in today's context opens us up to the reality that perspective and setting are important parts of our understanding and use of reason. You might call this the historical setting, right? Or historical perspective. Since we're a part of a particular culture in a particular time and place, we understand things in a particular way, right? And this is going to shape the way that we understand the religious tradition that we're presented with in our own native context, but also now other traditions, since we live in this global community and we're well aware of the other major faith traditions of the world. So when we engage not only our own tradition but also the other tradition, we have to recognize that we have certain ideas that are going to affect the way that we interpret it. This is unavoidable. The theologian Hans Georg Gadamer offers a nice vision of how theology can work in the contemporary world in which we have such a global perspective, in which we have different traditions in dialogue with one another. So the first step he talks about is becoming self-aware. We understand that our own tradition, right, the religious practices that we grew up with, the religious texts that we grew up with, just the comments, right, that we get from people in our society as a whole. It might not be particularly people might not even think that they're thinking about God or theology or something like that, but just the way that we understand the meaning of things is going to be affected by our own tradition. So we have to be aware of that and say, hey, this is what's going on. Okay. Second of all, we have to become open to rethinking our own interpretations. Right? Okay, why do I interpret my faith like this? You know, you see very different interpretations of Christianity when it comes to things like the afterlife, when it comes to things like the nature of God. You see very different interpretations of that just within the United States. Right? So again, this helps that when we recognize that there's different perspectives, different ways to see this stuff, we can then open our interpretations and rethink them. Right? Because just because there's different ways or different perspectives of seeing it, it doesn't mean that all the perspectives are equally valid. It doesn't mean that some aren't better than others. So when we do have our own tradition, we also have to become open to the insights of other traditions, right? We say, okay, this is the way that we understand this, and then we look at the way that they understand, try to understand the way that the other traditions also understand their own teachings, and also see that that might differ from the original intention of the founders of that tradition, and it might differ from the way that we interpret it, right? I mean, when I was in undergrad school, when I was in undergrad, I studied Buddhism a lot as part of my my undergraduate degree in theology. I think I had 2-3 courses in that kind of focused on Buddhism to some extent. Then, after college, I went to study Buddhism in Buddhist meditation centers in Burma and Nepal. And what I found was that a lot of time the Western interpretation of some of these basic Buddhist ideas was a little different than the understanding of those basic ideas in the native Buddhist cultures. So again, we see that there is an understanding and a way that anyone's context or perspective is going to shape the way that they understand their own tradition and others. But this opening to the insight from other traditions, you know, this opening, well, if you understand this in a certain context, then it might become more meaningful, right? But also understand that perspective and the way that you interpret it is going to matter. So again, we're really opening up to a possibility of different and therefore maybe better interpretations of not only our traditional faith, but also the faith of others and traditions of others. So then the final step, where you get this idea of fusions of horizons, is a way to merge these insights together for a fuller understanding of the truth. So in other words, you might take something that a point made from another faith, and that might deepen your understanding of something in your own faith. So I'm reminded here of the traditional Jain fable of the blind man and the elephant, in which several blind men are introduced to an elephant, and they all touch a different part of the elephant, right? And so they all kind of have a correct but partial perspective of what's really going on, of what they're really touching, right? So it's only when they're all put together in a certain way that they're going to get a fuller picture of the elephant. So hopefully theology can work like this too, that we will be able to fuse insights from our own tradition and the rethinking of our own tradition, right? And also bring in insights from other traditions that will help us deepen the fullness of truth, deepen our understanding of the fullness of truth that we have in our own faith. So on page 23 and 24, I was making the point that it really is impossible to think about the basic questions of the meaning of life except by means of particular tradition. Now, what's he saying? He's saying, well, when something big happens to you, when something that affects you happens to you, you're going to approach it from the perspective of meaning that you've been provided with in your culture. So we'll just give you an example. Let's say something bad happened to you, something that really disturbed you, something that made you question what was happening to you and why, right? So someone in a Christian Western worldview, even if they're not particularly religious, or maybe they don't even really think about God, or haven't thought about God up to this point, they might say, hey, why did God let this happen? Why did God let this thing happen to me, right? Now, someone from an Eastern religion like that believes in karma and reincarnation, like Buddhism or Hinduism, they might say, hey, what did I do, right? What did I do in my past life that deserves this awful thing happening to me now, right? Again, you might not even think about it. You might, be questioning, hey, do I believe in God, stuff like this? Do I believe in the laws of karma? Might not really be an everyday question for the person, but the person will, when something that evokes a sense of meaning in life comes up, what's going to happen? They're going to answer those questions of meaning with the answers supplied to them through their tradition and their culture, right? Now, again, when you become aware of this stuff, it all starts to change. You start to see different possibilities. You say, I interpret it this way. Do I have to interpret it this way? Right? Could I interpret it another way? And in that way, we can really inspect those assumed meanings of our tradition, right? And compare them not only with our own tradition, our own understanding of it, but see if we're true to the foundational tradition, true to the people whose experiences we're sharing, right? Going back to the founders. In this case, we go back to Christ and the apostles in the case of Christianity. And we're saying, wait a minute, is the way that we understand this, is that the way they would have understood this too? So in this course, you've probably already noticed, we're coming at things from the Christian tradition, and particularly the Roman Catholic tradition, right? So the Roman Catholic tradition is one of the oldest Christian traditions, and we can trace our tradition right back to the apostles and the early church. This doesn't mean that we are not taking wisdom or knowledge from the other traditions, right? You actually see, especially in contemporary theology, a real exchange between the major Christian traditions. Like in the book you're reading, you'll see that Abel is quoting Protestant theologians, Orthodox theologians, and Catholic theologians.